and welcome everybody to this Linea webinar. My name is Ana Maria Pola and I'm the Deputy Director of the Gender Violence and Health Center at LSHTM. And I also head the Learning Initiative on Norms, Exploitation and Abuse, otherwise known as Linea. Before I start, I want to also acknowledge my colleagues, Lottie Howard-Merrill, who, as you can see, is checking the chat and will be there for you if you have any questions on technical issues. We have Marjorie Pichon also supporting the webinar today. I will be introducing the webinar and then sharing the Q&A. So again, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to see so many people joining the webinar today. And we from Linea and the whole team, we really hope you and your families are keeping well under these current circumstances. So just as an introduction, I want to let you know a bit about Linea for those of you that are not that familiar with this initiative. The Linea project sits within the GVHC at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And it is an international initiative looking specifically at how social norm theory can be used to prevent the sexual exploitation and abuse of children and adolescents globally. And one of the things we do is creating this community of practice interested in social norms. And that's where this webinar sit. We try to bring together people from different backgrounds and introduce them to issues around social norms. We have included our Twitter handle and webpage on this first slide and encourage you to join the Linea Network mailing list if you haven't done so before. And you can learn more about future webinars and other Linea updates via our website. So today we're really looking forward to this webinar that is entitled From Theory to Practice, Shifting the Perception of Peer Norms in Group-Based Interventions. And we have lined up a fantastic presenter for you today. I'm so pleased to introduce you to Laurie Rollery, who has been working as a consultant for Linea since early 2019, assisting us with the development of the Linea Social Norms Intervention to prevent age-disparate transactional sex between adult men and adolescent girls in Tanzania. Laurie established her consultancy practice at Laurie Rollery Consulting in 2012. And previously she served as team lead and senior technical advisor for Gender and the Men as Partners program at Engender Health. She has extensive experience overseeing teams in developing evidence-informed interventions related to adolescent health, youth development, HIV prevention, and parenting. She has also led capacity building activities to support practitioners and evaluators in implementing and evaluating interventions. Laurie has authored or co-authored more than 70 publications, including curricula, journal articles, books, programming guides, and other resources. She is frequently invited to participate on advisory panels and provide technical reviews. Laurie has a Bachelor's of Science degree in Policy Analysis from Cornell University and MPH and MSW degrees from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and she currently lives in New York. The presentation will last about 40 minutes, leaving time for a Q&A session at the end. I have to tell you that Laurie's presentation is interactive, and so we warmly welcome you to use the chat function on your screen to ask questions if you feel like you need something clarified. Otherwise, you leave your questions till the end for the Q&A. But during the session, Laurie, in certain slides, will be asking you questions or will ask you to type in this chat function. So please feel free to use it. And as I said before, we'll be monitoring the chat box throughout the webinar. So please feel free to share any concerns or ideas you have, and including technical issues, and we will be trying to sort those out for you. I also have to tell you that we will be recording this webinar and we'll upload it onto the Linea YouTube channel, so you can go back to it if you want to and share with your contacts. Also, please be sure to keep yourself muted during the presentation. And so now over to Laurie. Enjoy.
Thank you, Ana Maria. That was a very kind introduction. I want to thank you, Ana Maria, and the whole Linea project in general, and particular Marjorie and Lottie for putting this webinar together. As Ana Maria said, we met about 2 years ago and started working on a curriculum that was designed to change social norms around age disparate sex around for girls and for men in Mwanza, Tanzania. And I'm going to be drawing on some of that experience throughout today's webinar to sort of illustrate some of the work and the theory behind social norms. So greetings, everyone. Greetings from New York, where it happens to be a very sunny, beautiful morning, which has been different from the last couple of weeks. So it's nice to start the day with the sunshine. I'm going to take myself off camera right now, and we're going to go over to the first slide of the webinar. And now that you know a little bit about Linea and a little bit about me, we want to find out a little bit about who's on the webinar. So we have two poll questions for you to answer to get a sense of who you are. And Lottie's gonna launch that poll, and we're going to give you about 20 seconds to answer. And then we'll see the results together. People are still answering. Okay, Lottie, I think we can stop it here. Sharing poll results. Okay. Well, it looks like we have a pretty diverse mix in the type of roles you all have, leaning towards researchers and evaluators. That's great. Interestingly, program developers, it's pretty even, but program developers are the lowest percentage. And I think the information I'm presenting today will be useful for everyone, but in particular, program developers. And how would you describe your experience working on social norms? This is brand new, moderately experienced, and I have a lot. Good. Okay. Well, I'm glad that we have some diversity and we have people that are experienced. I'm going to be tapping on that experience through the webinar, and especially at the end, I'm very interested in your questions as it might apply to your work and your experiences. If you've had experience that is different than what I'm presenting, we're all here to learn from each other for sure. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? Let's go through the learning objectives. First, we're going to do a quick review of key concepts related to social norms that I hope will get us warmed up. Next, we're going to talk about social norms as being one of several important determinants to consider when creating a theory of change for a behavior change intervention. Third, we will review 3 theories that can help guide the intentional development of social norm activities. In particular, a social norms approach, a gender transformative approach, and the theory of planned behavior. And lastly, I will share some examples of curriculum activities that apply these theories. And you're gonna help me a little bit along the way. Please note that today's focus is on curriculum-based interventions. We're not going to talk about community-based campaigns or other types of programs. It's really about group-based workshop type interventions. I want to also note that I'm going to be using the term social norms a lot, but I want to acknowledge that social norms are hard to shift with just a group-based intervention. What we can shift is peer norms or perception of peer norms, which can be a powerful first step in shifting social norms more widely in a community. So let's quickly review some basic terms associated with social norms and make sure we're clear on definitions. For those of you who took the little quiz at the beginning, the answers are embedded here in this slide. So social norms are the behavioral rules or expectations that a group of people conform to because they believe most other people in their group conform to the behavior, and that's called the descriptive norm. Most other people in their group believe they ought to conform to the behavior, and that's called the injunctive norm. Reference groups, or people who have influence, set the social norms, reinforce them, and at times can even police them. We conform to social norms because we want to fit in. It's kind of a natural instinct. We want to fit in with our community. We also conform to avoid sanctions, such as disapproval, punishment, isolation, or other types of negative consequences. So for those of you who took the little quiz at the beginning, I'm wondering if we could do a reaction at the bottom of your screen. You should see like a little smiley face. You could clap your hands if you got 100%. I'm not seeing any clapped hands, so that means either folks didn't see the survey, the quiz, or didn't get 100%, or don't know how to use the chat function, or I don't know how to use the clap function. Okay, well, I hope a few of you had a chance to quiz yourself in the beginning, and I hope this gives you the answers to that quiz. Okay, let's apply this now. Let's apply what I just discussed to an actual example. Let's say you're working in a region where girls' completion of secondary school is pretty low. You're in charge of this project, and the overall goal for you is to increase secondary school graduation rates for girls. You're working with your team to build a theory of change, and you want to include social norms. You've done some formative research, and you learned about some of the norms you would like to address. Using the chat box now, and make sure it goes to everyone. Using the chat box, suggest some examples of social norms that might work against, so not the positive norm, but some of the norms that are existing now that are working against the project goal of increasing secondary school graduation rates for girls. So take about 20 seconds or so to do that. Girls should focus on domestic duties. Thanks, Kate. Girls should stay home and help with their families. Thanks, Marjorie. Sylvie, early marriage, isolation during menstruation. Good one, Poonam. Pressure to marry, bear children. Mary, girls should get married. Maimuna, girls are supposed to take care of the home. Yeah, very good. Great, great. Peter, the primary role of women and girls is to be home caretaker, not educator. That's right. Okay, so you've come up with a lot here. Next, you can click Lottie, great. So here are some examples, and you've captured these all and more. Girls ought to be married by the age of 16. Girls ought to take care of the household or family chores, which does not require secondary education. If resources are limited, sons ought to go to secondary school rather than daughters. So let's say this is let's say in this hypothetical project, you're also searching for who the reference group would be. Who are the people that are influencing, kind of managing or reinforcing this norm? Real quickly, who would you say that reference group would be? If you could use the chat box again. Families, elders, men, community leaders, parents. Great, great. Great. Grands, I'm assuming that means grandparents, faith leaders. Yeah, okay, excellent. So for this particular project, we're going to use parents. Lottie, if we could show that. Yeah, parents in the community is one example of a reference group. Okay, so now you know what some of the norms are that are working against your goal, and you know who's kind of, reinforcing them. So you start designing the intervention. You might want to look at those negative norms because they're important to identify. And you might want the group to design an activity to help the group think critically about where those norms come from and why they're in place. But you want to spend most of your time talking about the positive norm, the norm you would like to see as the dominant norm in the community, the norm that will support the behavior change. And sometimes what I see in some programs is that a lot of time is spent on those negative norms we just talked about, the ones that are working against us. Well, and again, it's important to review those norms, but more importantly, it's important to think of some of the positive norms, the norms that you want to encourage, and spend the majority of your time talking about the positive. So in this case, Lottie, you can show us. Here are some of the positive norms that you may want to focus on. That girls, in fact, in our community, it's the norm. They graduate secondary school. And maybe you might say equally as do boys. Girls in our community, it's the norm to plan for a future where they have a choice to work outside the home for pay. And in our community, it's the norm for young women, girls to grow to be women who are also economic providers for their family. Next slide. So it's important to note that social norms alone are probably not sufficient for behavior change. This is another thing I see sometimes with programs, is that there's a lot of excitement about social norms and it becomes the focus, the only focus of the intervention. But there are other factors, and you think about this scenario about secondary school education graduation. There are other factors, other determinants that play a role in parents' decision to send their daughters to secondary school. And we could spend a whole lot of time here talking about them, but I'm just gonna let Lottie share a couple that I came up with. The first might be fear that parents will be judged by others in the community if they don't follow traditional gender roles. For girls and boys, it's an example of a sanction that if they go along with it, their family might be judged. The belief, incorrect belief, but the belief that girls and women don't make good teachers, doctors, accountants, etc. Or simply a lack of awareness, because it's been a norm for so long, a lack of awareness about benefits an educated daughter can bring to the family. Next slide. So one of the best practices in developing a social norms intervention, or in fact, any kind of intervention, is creating a theory of change. And this is something that we did with the age disparate sex curriculum with the Linea Project, and Peter Pollack, who I see is on our webinar today, the primary author of that curriculum. We developed a theory of change to really be very deliberate about the determinants, the behaviors, and the activities that we were going to design. So let me give you an example of a theory, an outline, really a partial theory of change for a project that we did with East Africa Partners on women's land rights. You'll notice this theory is developed from right to left. We start first by defining the goal for the intervention and the priority population. So in this case, the goal is to increase women's ownership of land in target sites. It's not the only indicator of women's land rights, but it's one. Then we identified the individual behaviors we want to see change. In this case, we started with a men's curriculum because men are considered a very influential reference group with regard to women realizing their land rights. And within the umbrella category of men were also village elders, largely village elders, who are also an important reference group. Next, we analyzed those behaviors, looking at the first behavior in the column, in the green column, husbands co-register land with wives. We asked ourselves why. Why is it that some men co-register land with their wives and some don't? So using our formative assessment data, we identified determinants of those behaviors. We identified some of the reasons why, one being the perception of peer norms about registering land, in addition to others. And again, this is partial. This column was actually quite long. So only after going through this three-step analysis did we then start to think of curriculum activities that are intentionally, deliberately linked to those determinants. And in that fourth step, we consulted established theories and approaches aimed at changing these different determinants, and in particular, the theories and approaches aimed at changing peer norms and social norms. Next slide. So we've limited time today, but I'm going to talk about 3 social norm change theories or approaches. As I mentioned earlier, social norms approach, gender transformative approach, and theory of planned behaviors. I don't want to imply that these are the only theories that can inform the development of social norm activities. They're just a sampling. The overall goal here is for you to learn about the theories, but also to see how they can be applied when designing curriculum-based activities. And we're going to apply them to 3 different topics. We're going to talk about social norms related to behaviors related to teen pregnancy prevention, women's land rights, and intimate partner violence prevention. I want to mention also that much of the information that I'm going to go over now in the webinar is summarized in 2 handouts that that's on the website. And we'll talk about this at the end, and we're going to also share with you. Lottie, do you want to say something about that, the handouts?
Yeah, briefly, I can just say that at the end we'll be sending out an email to everyone who registered, and it will have the handouts, and it will also have Laurie's slide and a link to the recording as well.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, we'll do that later. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, next slide. So let's start with a social norms approach. In the 1980s, 2 researchers, Alan Berkowitz and Wesley Perkins, did a study with US college students and found that students held exaggerated beliefs about the normal frequency and consumption habits of other students with regard to alcohol. This finding helped them in developing an approach to shifting social norms. The social norms approach says a person's perception of a social norm may not be the actual norm. The task for the program developer is to correct the misperception, which is called pluralistic ignorance, and demonstrate that a majority of people do not engage in the particular unhealthy behavior, and in fact do engage in a healthy behavior. By correcting this misperception, an intervention can motivate participants to engage in the healthier behavior. So let's apply, next slide. Let's apply a social norms approach to a teen pregnancy prevention curriculum to start. One of the curriculum's behavioral goals in this, this particular curriculum is to increase participants' use of condoms when those participants decide to become sexually active. Next slide. One type of activity you can design to surface those perceived and actual norms is an anonymous poll. There are various ways to set up an anonymous poll. We just did one here. It wasn't anonymous, but I'm imagining you could do that on Zoom. But you're in the classroom, and let's say you decide to do it with little pieces of paper that's kind of like a mini survey that say agree or disagree on the paper. After you give them those papers, then you would ask the first question on this slide, which is about the actual norm. So if I decide to have sex, again, this is anonymous, I believe that I'm going to use a condom. So the student would mark agree or disagree on their piece of paper. Then they would drop that answer into a paper bag or some receptacle that's confidential or no one can see, an anonymous type of bag. No name should be associated with the votes. Again, the first question is about the actual norm related to condom use. This is the reality of what students plan to do, the reality of their intentions anyway. The next question is about the perceived norm. I believe that most others at my school are going to use condoms if they have sex. Again, students vote and put their little mini survey in a paper bag. By the way, you want to make sure you label those paper bags correctly. One that's clearly labeled question A and another that's clearly labeled question B. Next slide. Now the facilitator or an assistant needs a couple of minutes to count the votes and calculate the percentages. So in this example, there were 20 students. For question A, 18 of the 20 students said agree, 90%, overwhelming majority. And for question B, this was the perceived norm, less than half of the students said agree, 45%. Okay, so now, next slide. Now the facilitator shares the results of the poll with all of the students. This is public. It might sound something like this. The majority of you, or 90%, agreed with the first statement. 90% of you agreed that if you decide to have sex, you believe you're going to use a condom. Lottie, next question. However, less than half of you, 45%, thought that most of your other friends, the other students in the class, would not use a condom. In other words, most of you agreed that you personally would use a condom if you have sex, but you didn't think your peers would think the same way. When you're reporting the findings, you're showing the students that the majority of members in their group actually intend to act in a way that is consistent with their personal intentions, correcting their misperception and reinforcing the positive norm. In a way, this reporting, this public reporting is like giving students permission to choose the healthy behavior. They don't have to worry about a sanction because, in fact, the majority of others are behaving in the way that they would behave. Immediately after reporting the results, there's a large group discussion with questions like these. How does it feel to know that most people in the class thought others would not use condoms, but in actuality, the majority of you said you would? Why do you think many of you thought that your peers would think differently than you? Why do some people disagree that most students like you will use condoms if they have sex? Where do these expectations come from? And finally, tell us why you think it is indeed possible to use a condom when you have sex. The idea here is to make sure participants understand the majority of their group do not support the desired behavior and get them to reinforce that the behavior is possible and a good idea in front of each other. Again, during this discussion, you are trying to correct the misperception about the desired norm. Next slide. I just gave you one example of 4 possible poll results. I gave you the example for scenario 1. Most participants plan to use condoms, the actual norm, but did not perceive that their peers would. I gave you an example of how to respond and process those results. However, there are 3 other combinations of how the poll results could pan out. I'm not going to talk about how to process each scenario now, but you can find this guidance on how to do so in the handout I mentioned earlier. Next slide. The second approach that can be applied to developing social norm activities, particularly related to gender norms, is a gender transformative approach. A gender transformative approach, as the name implies, is about transforming or changing, shifting harmful and inequitable gender norms. A gender transformative approach has 5 components that mostly evolve in sequence, but not always. In other words, these are tasks that the learners need to complete in an activity that incorporate the approach. So what are those tasks? Gender transformative programs first raise awareness about inequitable gender norms and where they come from. Question the costs of abiding to these norms to themselves and to others. Show the benefits of abiding to healthy, equitable gender norms to themselves and others. Again, this is the positive norm. 4, the learners go through a process where they redefine, reinvent, or replace the negative norm with equitable and healthy norms that allow all people to thrive. And last, identify ways to support others who break away from the artificial confines of inequitable gender norms, and in doing so, kind of reducing the sanctions, changing the reference group, or trying to build a reference group that is supportive of the desired norms. So, next slide. Let's apply a gender transformative approach to an activity associated with the women's land rights curriculum I referred to earlier. If you remember, one behavior that we were aiming to change is the co-registering of land between husbands and wives. Inequitable gender norms was an important determinant included in our theory of change. Next slide. So a common gender transformative activity that I'm sure many of you have used before is and can be applied to different program topics, is the gender box. As I describe the activity, notice how the critical reflection questions on the left, and Lottie, you can show those, thanks. Yeah, you can show all of them. Notice how the critical reflection questions on the left align with the 5 GSA components I just presented. In fact, Lottie, if you could go back a slide. Back, yeah. One more, sorry. So notice here are the tasks, right? And I color coded them so that they can align with the activity. So we can go back to the gender box slide. Okay. So if you pull this slideshow to look at again, you'll notice that the alignment is deliberate. The questions here are certainly not exhaustive. I'm sure if you looked at that first slide and saw what the tasks are, you would be very creative in coming up with questions that may be variations of what you see here, or additional questions that would meet the task. The activity starts with brainstorming the typical roles, behaviors, and characteristics that are expected of men and women in their community, and the participants record those characteristics, those gender norms on flip chart. The second step is participants reflect on the cost of the consequences to themselves and to others who are abiding to these norms, especially as they relate to the particular focus of the curriculum, in this case, women's land rights. The facilitator then draws a box, as you can see, the green line there, draws a box around a list of characteristics and leads a discussion about what it's like to be constrained by the box. The next question is about who puts us in the box, or the reference group. You can see some of those forces on the perimeter of the boxes in the photo with the purple arrows pointing inwards or pushing inwards. Next, the group talks about ways to live outside the box. They identify healthy norms, and the benefits of living outside the box. Again, it's important to spend more time talking about this component, the positive norms, rather than belabor discussion about the constraint of negative norms. Last, learners talk about the challenges of living outside the box and how they can support each other in doing so. As a side note, the metaphor of a box has proven to be an easy to understand, easy to remember image that participants often refer to throughout the program and serves as a good reminder of the positive norms the intervention aims to change. Next slide. Some of the questions on the previous slide can be used to simply facilitate large and small group discussions with flip chart and markers, as I just showed you in that picture. They can also be explored through an interactive activity. For example, you could use a story to help learners identify gender norms and who or what is reinforcing them, the first GTA component, and then discuss the rest of the questions as they relate to characters in the story, or the rest of the questions related to those other 4 components. Use the story as a prompt for discussion. Using a story or a newspaper article or a video can also be a great way to prompt discussion because it's a little less threatening to talk about someone else as opposed to yourself. But when the group becomes more comfortable, it's important to personalize the questions through individual reflection activities or take-home assignment or journaling or making some type of personal commitment. In other words, talking in the abstract about others without having to think about yourself is less likely to make change. And this is also sometimes what I would call a mistake when I see in curricula, there's all this discussion and critical reflection of this gender norm thing in abstract, but then there's no application or personalization. Okay, next slide. The third theory that I would like to present is the theory of planned behavior. And this theory posits that attitudes, subjective norms, which are the same as the descriptive norms that we discussed earlier, and perceived behavioral control lead to intention, which is the most proximal determinant to behavior change. So these determinants, these concepts kind of work with each other, influence each other, lead to intention, which leads to behavior. I'm going to break down each of these concepts one by one, as well as talk about how to change them. Next slide. To explore how we can apply the theory of planned behavior to curriculum-based activities, I'm going to borrow from one of the intimate partner violence prevention curricula I co-authored for men in Ethiopia. One behavioral objective was to ask for sexual consent from his partner. Next slide. The first concept in the theory of planned behavior is attitude. An attitude is a combination of cognitive and affective components. Attitudes are one's beliefs about something and the evaluation of the same thing, implying a liking or disliking or a favorable or unfavorable view. When beliefs and evaluation are both positive, you have a positive attitude toward behavior, but beliefs and attitudes are not always aligned. Next slide. You can click. For example, let's go back to that teen pregnancy prevention program. One of the participants might have an attitude like this. I don't think condoms work because they break, and I really don't like the way they feel. And they interrupt the mood. In this case, the person does not believe that condoms work, and their evaluation of condoms is negative. This is not a supportive attitude towards behavior change and provides an opportunity for the developer to do some work on the beliefs and on the evaluation. Next quote, yeah. This quote says, I know women have the right to own land. You know, they deserve to. But if I co-register land with my wife, other men in my tribe will think I'm henpecked. In this case, the belief is good, but the evaluation of the behavior seems to be negative. This attitude is also not supportive of the desired behavior and needs attention. And then the last quote, going back to intimate partner violence prevention. Lottie, good. This person says, asking for sexual consent is a respectful thing to do, and it will improve the relationship I have with my wife. In this example, both the belief and the evaluation are what we're looking for. So let's say you're working with a combination that's more of the green quote and more of the salmon colored quote. What can you do to help change those attitudes? Okay, let's talk about some principles. 3 principles here that I'm going to talk about. The first is to show relevance and personalized benefits. Show the learner that the benefit of engaging in the behavior and personalize those benefits. Again, don't talk about them in the abstract, talk about them personally. Acknowledge barriers to engaging in the desired behavior and help learners make a plan to overcome them. The second is to engage participants in arguments. By arguments, I don't mean fistfights or, you know, getting into a loud screaming match. I mean engaging learners in activities where they have to discuss the pros and cons about certain behaviors. And then as the facilitator, guide them in seeing the benefit of the behavior and or the costs of not engaging in the behavior. It's important that learners do this reasoning rather than the facilitator. The facilitator is there only to guide the process. The third is to create cognitive dissonance. Dissonance is an internal feeling that comes from some type of inconsistency between what one believes and what one does, what one's actions are. Dissonance might feel like a mild stress or discomfort or like a mild anxiety. When one is faced with cognitive dissonance, there is an impulse to decrease it in order to ease that discomfort. To resolve the dissonance, one may look at 2 things, either changing the behavior so it's in sync with the belief, or to change the belief so that it's in sync with the behavior. So again, this is another principle for working on changing attitudes. And let me show you how that could be applied. Next slide. In thinking about the IPV, Intimate Partner Violence curriculum again, one activity aimed at changing attitudes is the analysis and discussion of a story or a case study, or it could be a video or a radio program or podcast about a husband and wife that do use sexual consent with each other, and then compare that story with another story about a husband and wife who do not use sexual consent. This is followed up by a discussion or other activity where participants have to talk about how sexual consent affects the characters in the story and identifies the benefits of sexual consent. The benefits should be relevant to the learners, benefits that motivate them. And again, once the comfort is established, these benefits need to be applied or thought about personally, how it would work in their own relationships. Next slide. In a forced choice or vote with your feet activity, participants are asked to stand up and move from one side of the room to the other in order to agree or disagree with a series of statements that are based on values, beliefs, or opinions, and then asked to explain or argue their points of view. For example, with a group of men participating in an IPV program, Intimate Partner Violence, they might be asked to respond to a statement like, you know, sometimes men just can't control their impulse to have sex. After the facilitator reads the statement, the men move to one side of the room or the other, and then the facilitator guides the group in a discussion about why they agree or disagree with the statement. The idea being that arguments from the disagree side might help to persuade the agree side, or that the agree side might find flaws in their reasoning as the discussion takes place. There's also a large group debrief about what it feels like to believe in something that is different from their peers. Again, thinking about the sanctions and the pressure we sometimes feel to go along with our peers when we might not want to. Another activity is where participants act as counselors or psychologists or a lawyer or a village elder in providing advice to characters in a story. Sorry about that. After first going through other activities about the consequences of violence and alternative ways to manage conflict, participants are asked to be a quote unquote relationship expert who has an advice column in a newspaper. Small groups are assigned a letter from a reader and then write a response back to the reader with advice on how to deal with the marital conflict, and then present, and this is important, present their response to the group, present the positive norms to the group. The idea here is to create dissonance. As relationship experts, participants advise about using some of the nonviolent techniques they just learned about how to resolve conflict and the benefits to the relationships in doing so. They're creating a sense of dissonance about what they believe and what they say they're going to, and behavior. If you're acting as an advisor, it creates dissonance to not practice the advice that you give. To resolve the dissonance, the hope is that learners will act in accordance with the advice they share in front of their peers. Next slide. Okay, in the theory of planned behavior, the subjective norm is similar to the descriptive norm I described at the beginning of the webinar. That is what I believe most other people in the community do. Next slide. In this case, we want to shift the subjective norm to something like this. I believe other men like me ask their wives for consent to have sex, as opposed to, I believe other men like me have sex with their wives regardless if their wives have a desire to have sex. The principles for shifting a subjective norm are observing other men talk about the benefit. So having the open discussions where other men are reinforcing the norm, showing that reference groups in the group are supporting the norm. Practicing the skill with peers observing. Again, this is creating a new norm. You're seeing other people like you behaving in the desired way. Sharing positive experience of applying the skill. So maybe a take-home assignment that they have to do with their wife and come back to the class or to the group and talk about the positive experience. Again, trying to support that subjective norm. And sharing examples of positive deviance. By positive deviance, I mean men who behave in accordance with the desired norm and experience positive consequences. These might be men in the group, other men in the community, or well-known figures in society. Next slide.
Excuse me, Laurie, Anna Maria here. Just to let you know that we have 12 minutes left.
Okay.
I know this is very useful, and I think a lot of people is finding it is very useful, but an alternative approach is if you can start writing your questions, and we will still make sure that we get some questions, but if in any case we don't manage to do it live, then we can answer some of your queries later on. I think that's the best balance, so you can try and finish with them.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the theory of I'm going to talk about perceived behavioral control because I think that's very important, and then end there. So we're going to talk about perceived behavioral control, which is about having the skill to do a certain behavior and the self-efficacy or confidence that you can perform that skill in a real life situation. Next slide. So perceived behavioral control is about having the skill and the self-efficacy to ask for consensual sex and accept my wife's answer. So the principles are 4. Right, so the first one is about breaking down the skill. One mistake I see in some curricula is the lack of skill steps or a framework. Sometimes I see a set of tips that are generated from participants or given out in a handout. Tips are good, but they don't necessarily break down the skill into deliberate sequential steps. Then it's important, once that skill is broken down, that the skill is modeled. Another mistake I see sometimes is that the facilitator puts the learners to work without first modeling the skill, or ask for volunteers to model the skill in a role play or skit in front of the group without first having practice. This sort of makes me cringe sometimes, because instead of modeling the positive norms, if participants don't know the skill, they may model the undesired norms, and observers or the rest of the learners in the group are often then left confused. It's important for the facilitator to model the skill as well as possible, so that the learners can see how it should look like. Alternatively, the facilitator can work with learners before the session to help them in modeling the skill. Okay, and then the next step is we can stay there, Lottie. So the next principle is the learner practices the skill. So, and practice that skill multiple times, from easy examples to more complex. So start with a simple application of the skill so that the learner begins to gain confidence, and then move toward mastery of the skill with more complex scenarios. This will help to build the self-efficacy part. Again, sometimes in curricula, I'll see a nice 45-minute activity about the learners practicing a skill, and then that's it. And if you think of any of the skills that you have, it's unlikely that you mastered that skill in, one 45-minute activity. You need practice. And then lastly, while practicing the skill, the learner will likely need some coaching and encouragement. And this can be done by the facilitator or by peers. One tool you can use is an observer checklist, where a peer has a list of skill steps in front of them and can objectively give feedback to the person who's practicing the skill. So let me, last slide here, Lottie. So in this sexual consent scenario, you may or may not disagree with all these steps, but just for an example, the steps for asking for sexual consent might be: first, assess your partner's mood. Is your partner tired, preoccupied with something? Next step, go slow. Ask your partner if they want to have sex. Be creative, romantic in how you do so. If they say no, it means no. Respect their answer. If they say yes, move forward. Pay attention to their pleasure as much as your own. Check in and clarify consent if needed. A person can change their mind at any time. Again, you may want to adjust these steps, but the point here is that you're providing guidance on how to perform the skill effectively. This is especially important if the skill is brand new. The steps might be generated by participants and/or presented to them. I want to emphasize again that you want to make sure the negative practice is not modeled or reinforced, as this negatively affects the subjective norm we talked about earlier. Subjective norms are influenced by observation. Be sure that observation is of the desired behavior. Okay, I was going to talk a little bit about intentions, which is that last piece of planned behavior, but I think we should move to questions at this point. And if you're interested in intentions, again, you'll see more about it in the handout that I provided, and you can take a look at these 2 slides that have to do with intention. So Ana Maria, I'll pass it to you.
Fantastic, thank you very much. So we have 6 minutes. we've had a lot of interest during your presentation, and I think people in general are finding the tips and the sort of application of the theory very, very useful. So unfortunately, I don't think we'll have time to answer all of them, but what I've promised is that we'll try to answer them offline, and some people are even suggesting to keep the conversation virtually going, so we can definitely try some of that. So I'm going to start from the beginning, and if you are happy to, I can unmute yourself and you can answer the questions directly. So Sally Biddle, are you still with us, Sally? You asked a question at the beginning of the conversation about additional factors that somewhat were related to the social and gender norms. And I don't know if you still want to raise that question.
Thank you. Yes, I am still here, Anna. I think it was more a comment than a question, and a very big thank you, Laurie. It's been a really fascinating presentation, and your work is fantastic. I'm really keen to have a look at some of the curricula that you have developed. I did just insert another question though, and it might be something that others are interested in. I think one of the biggest challenges that I have seen in trying to implement these kinds of programs that can use a lot of participatory methodologies and rely on a very confident facilitator who can help the participants think critically and to sometimes kind of question them. It's very difficult to find people who have enough confidence to do that, and also people who perhaps have the kind of values that align with the values of the curriculum. And I think that's such a huge challenge, because often we have these really fantastic curriculum materials and they work from an evidence-based perspective. They come from, you know, they're informed by theory, but when you look at how they're being rolled out on the ground, we're often left wanting in terms of the capacity of people to deliver them well. So that's my one question. Thanks. Over.
It's interesting what you just brought up. Immediately, I think back to the theory of planned behavior, right? You're talking about attitude, you're talking about subjective norms of their peers, and you're talking about perceived behavior control, which is, you know, as a facilitator, you have these skills, and you want to develop skills that lead to effective behavior as a facilitator. So the model of the theory of planned behavior might help you in designing training, but there's no doubt about it. As I said earlier, to develop self-efficacy, you need practice, 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 and facilitators need training, training, practice, practice.
Yeah, and if I can add something that we have been seeing as well is that having a sort of monitoring groups and getting the facilitators together and discuss the challenges and their own learning throughout implementation seems to be also quite important, because they become experts and they can sort of help each other in the transformation as well. So I think embedding those in the program, it's important. I want to then, I think we have time for one more, and I sort of took the liberty to sort of put together two issues raised by Deborah Chilcote and Mamouna. And it's basically, it has to do with the current situation. So how do we move away from sort of polling programs, moving away from paper? And that connects also with Mamouna's question on how to translate group learning to virtual platforms. And I think this is coming obviously from the current context. So how do you continue this great work, but virtually? Do we have any ideas, Laurie?
Yeah, you know, I think we're all learning, or I'll say I'll own it. I'm still learning how to use these virtual platforms. I think it can be done with we happen to be using Zoom today. I think it can be done using virtual platforms, but I think with smaller groups. I think it's harder to do something around social norms when you're dealing with 25 people. I could see it being done with something like 8 to 10 people, where people can really see each other. And can go into breakout rooms to help to work with each other to put together a skit, or to be that relationships expert to work together and then come back and present. But what's important is that there's a lot of social observation of the positive norm. It's important that it gets personalized. So to talk in the abstract first, but to personalize it, and not to be uncomfortable with silence. I mean, I think that's something that I've been noticing with Zoom, is that you need to sort of pull people in. But once the group becomes a little bit more comfortable, I see people participating more. So, I mean, that's a really quick answer. It's something we can discuss at some point.
Thank you.
Discuss more or develop more. Anna Maria, I'm willing to go another 5 minutes. I know people have to go, but if you want to do a few more questions, and for those who have to go, I wish you health. I wish your loved ones health and sanity as we go through this uncharted territory. Yeah, and so I want to leave people with this last quote from Nelson Mandela, who said, it always seems impossible until it's done. And the reason why I picked this is because, let me make really clear, social norms takes time. It's not like learning, it's not like learning some new information, knowledge, or even learning a new skill. It takes time, but you maybe can master it in a month or two, depending on the skill. But social norm change can be done. Look at the success we've had in shifting norms about women's use of family planning, cutting down on waste and recycling, tobacco use, and even now more recently, using masks to protect each other from COVID-19. And I happen to be one of these people who reminds my friends about using masks when they go outside. And I hope I'm serving as a reference group for them. Some of these changes seemed impossible and took years to change, but we were able to do it. So stick with it and have patience, and try to develop the materials in the most informed, or the activities in the most informed way. And again, email me. Here's my email here on the slide at any time. If I can share actual curriculum activities where you have the instructional plan, or if I can answer your questions more deliberately, I'm happy to do that by email or Skype call or whatever works best for you.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the participants for joining and staying for some more minutes. As Lottie said, we will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered, and you will get the presentation slides and the related reading. It will also include a link to an evaluation of the webinar. So please, if you can spare some time, that will be really helpful for us to know, to assess our own webinars and know if this is the kind of thing you are hoping for. And we will be also sharing the recording on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. The link will be posted on this slide. It is posted on this slide. Thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of the week. And we hope to see you soon again in our next webinar. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.